Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. A word about CESPA. It's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. And it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. This episode will focus on the escalating diplomatic row between Canada and India. But before we get to the discussion, let me put forth what's known so far. On 17 September, Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, rose in the country's House of Commons and revealed that Canadian intelligence and security agencies had been actively pursuing, these are actually his words, actively pursuing credible allegations. Now, this is an interesting thing, and we're going to discuss this. He said credible allegations. He didn't say credible intelligence. So I'm going to ask my guests if there is a difference between credible allegations and credible intelligence of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar. He also, in the same speech, told the House that Canada had declared its deep concerns to the top intelligence and security officials of the Indian government. And he then went on to say that when he sat down for a bilateral with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the sidelines of the G20 summit, he had, and once again these are his words, brought them, as in those concerns, personally and directly to Prime Minister Modi in no uncertain terms. We also know that Canada had until then, and this is also per Prime Minister Trudeau, pursued quiet diplomacy with India over the issue and had also taken Canada's allies, by which presumably he meant G7 and also the Five Eyes Club, of which Canada is a member, into confidence. India's immediate reaction was to dismiss Mr. Trudeau's accusation, and the Ministry of External Affairs of India put out a statement which said allegations of the government of India's involvement in any act of violence in Canada are absurd and motivated. Similar accusations made by Trudeau to Prime Minister Narendra Modi had been completely rejected. The Indian statement also said that the accusation was meant to shift focus away from Khalistani terrorists. Now, this is a term that India uses for separatist Sikhs who want to create a separate homeland, which they call Khalistan, away from Khalistani terrorists and extremists who have been provided shelter in Canada. And then the statement went on to say, we urge the government of Canada to take prompt and effective legal action against all anti-India elements operating from their soil. India also suspended visas for Canadian citizens. Earlier, Canada had thrown out India's top intelligence agent, and New Delhi had responded by giving a Canadian diplomat 5 days to leave. Now, recently, speaking at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York, India's Foreign Minister, S. Jaishankar, claimed that Delhi had told Ottawa that the government of India was not involved in the killing, but if Canada had something relevant, India was open to looking at it. He claimed in the same program at CFR that India had been badgering the Canadians about its claims that organized criminals are based there, a reference to separatists like Nijjar, adding that India had made a large number of extradition requests. And then he went on to say, and these are his words, the picture is not complete without the context. That's an interesting statement, by the way. You also have to appreciate that in the last few years, Canada actually has seen a lot of organized crime relating to the secessionist forces. Now, there are two issues here. One is the accusation that Indian agents assassinated a Canadian national on Canadian soil. Those investigations are ongoing, but Canada appears quite sure. The U.S. ambassador to Canada has gone on record to suggest that Canada got the intel from the Five Eyes resources. The second issue, equally troublesome, especially from the point of view of the United States, and I would add also the United Kingdom, is that if the accusation is proven right, what's going to happen then? Canada is a treaty ally. India is a state the US is positioning to play a bigger role in the Indo-Pacific, which is a new designation for the geographically, I must add, more accurate term Asia-Pacific. So let's at this point dive into our discussion. I have with me Derek Grossman, who's a senior defense analyst at the RAND Corporation. He focuses on a range of national security policy and Indo-Pacific security issues and closely tracks U.S. China competition throughout the region. But more to our present purpose, frankly, before RAND, Mr. Grossman served over a decade in the intelligence community. He was the daily intelligence briefer to the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency and to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. He also served at the National Security Agency and worked at the CIA on the President's daily brief staff. With him is Dr. Christopher Clary, Associate Professor of Political Science at University at Albany. Dr. Clary has authored books on Pakistan and India, the most recent being The Difficult Politics of Peace, Rivalry in Modern South Asia. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with me on this program. Now, Derek, let me begin with the obvious. Do you think there is a prima facie case against India? And I ask this because in an interview with CTV's Question Period that aired last Sunday, David Kern, the US ambassador to Canada, which I also said this in my opening, and I quote from what he said, there was shared intelligence among Five Eyes partner that helped lead Canada to making the statements that the Prime Minister made.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And so I think there's still a lot to be determined here, right? Because as you mentioned and has been talked about over the last week, Canada has these allegations, okay, based on an investigation that they've conducted, that, India committed an extrajudicial killing on Canadian territory. And it is unclear at this point what the details are of that investigation. And so we are sitting here, what is it now, 8 or 9 days since Trudeau made that announcement, right? I can almost guarantee you there are going to be many twists and turns to this in the coming weeks and months. And so it's difficult to predict. But if Trudeau's allegation, if Trudeau wants to kind of, follow up on those allegations, they're going to have to provide more information, more details on what they believe happened, right? And that can be done in one of two ways. They can either do so publicly because it's already a public case, right? And I don't think that would go over particularly well with India and perhaps maybe even with the United States if it was intelligence that was collected by the United States, right, through the Five Eyes network, or they can handle it privately, right, through diplomatic negotiations, which I think makes the most sense. And that's what I'm really hoping to see. And it was interesting. You mentioned Jai Shankar when he was at the United Nations the other day, and then he also went to the Council on Foreign Relations and did an event there. And he was asked a direct question about the allegations. And he said, look, we were not involved in this. We stand by that statement. However, we are willing to listen and to look into it. I'm paraphrasing, right? But that's essentially what he said, which I think is a really good, it's a really good off-ramp here, right? To start talking about it behind the scenes rather than out there in public, because out in public doesn't really do much good, right? And so that is my kind of hope, but that also turns out to be my analysis in terms of the way it is going. I see an opening really kind of on both sides, right? And I mentioned the Indian side, right? So we'll look into it, we'll listen, right? But on the Canadian side, it's important to mention that on Sunday, the Canadian Defense Minister, Bill Blair, actually said that India is still an important strategic country to Canada within the context of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, right? And so it kind of sounded like Ottawa was trying to dial it back a bit, right? To not pour, gasoline to further inflame this fire, right? So I think that there are actually some good indications that this is going to be resolved privately and diplomatically. Right.
So can I offer a hypothesis and then draw on your intelligence background? So obviously, when something like this happens, as a bombshell of sorts, in many ways, And it also puts the United States in a tough spot. Obviously, you've got Canada, which is a treaty ally, and then, of course, you've got India, which you're positioning as a very important state in your Indo-Pacific strategy. So India obviously is going to say, oh, we didn't do this. But at the same time, through back channels, they could reach out. So between the public denial and private diplomacy, my hypothesis is that there is a band in which efforts are being taking place. I mean, you use the term off-ramp, which I think is really appropriate. Efforts are afoot to try and work this out, in which case, both sides will somehow dial down whatever they've been doing, because frankly, it's been tit for tat up until now. So do you think that my hypothesis makes any sense at all?
Yeah, I think that's in line with what I'm saying, that I believe that the back channel negotiation is kind of where we're heading here. But again, it's early days, we have to keep in mind. And so if India were to escalate further, right, for example, just the other day, they said no more visa services for any Canadians traveling to India from anywhere in the country, in the world, right? So, I mean, if we're going to see more of that type of escalation, then I think the back channel may be threatened, right? But like I said, I do think that we're seeing kind of a dialing back at this point. One of the question marks I have, and again, kind of leveraging my background in intelligence, is if this did in fact come through the Five Eyes network, right? What is the shareability, or what is the releasability of that intelligence, right? Because usually the collector of that intelligence owns that intelligence, right?
Yes.
There are exceptions to the rule. Sometimes it's jointly collected, things like that. But what it sounds like from the reporting, and I am not privy to any of the details, other than what we see in the public reporting, is that it is owned, by either the United States or another one of the Five Eyes partners. And so how is that information then going to be shared to the Indians, right? And it sounds like maybe some of it was shared, but in a more kind of sanitized format, taking out some of the details, which might disclose sensitive sources and methods, things like that, right? But if the Indians are really going to be convinced of the Canadian case, they're probably going to have to see all of the details. And so how is that then negotiated between Canada and the U.S. or whoever provided the intelligence to begin with, right? It's going to be sticky.
Okay, before I get to Chris Clary, just a follow-up question. What do you think of David Cohn's statement with reference to the Five Eyes intelligence? I mean, you talked about the releasability, you talked about the shareability and the rest of it. What exactly do you think that means? Does that mean that, and I'm asking this also because one of the legislators who's part of Trudeau's treasury benches, who's a Canadian Sikh, has said, and it's been reported, that I've seen the debrief, and I am absolutely convinced that India is behind this. Maninder Singh, who's a very close friend of slain Mr. Nijjar, also spoke with CTV and said that Mr. Nijjar, a few days before he was assassinated, had actually found a tracker in his vehicle. And so there is, at least to the extent of, even the criminal gangs now use the trackers and the rest of it, but at least there is a lot of circumstantial evidence, and also one has to find out what, in this particular case, what exactly Ambassador Cohen meant when he said that this intelligence came from Five Eyes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty murky world out there, right? So
it certainly is. Wheels within wheels.
Just a lot we don't know. I mean, the local Vancouver press is reporting that Nijjar, before his untimely death or murder, was in contact regularly with Canadian intelligence. And so that is now kind of leading some Indians, maybe many or most Indians, to believe that he was like on the payroll or something like that, and was providing intelligence or working somehow on behalf of the Canadian version of the CIA, right? So there's just a lot we don't know, and it's very difficult.
Well, it's a world of disinformation, frankly. I mean, you must have seen reports emanating from India which talked about the fact that perhaps Prime Minister Trudeau was doing the lines because his plane could not take off because of cocaine and the rest of it. So it kind of moves from the sublime to the sheer ridiculous. But
I think what we need to do is let the dust settle a little bit to try to better understand the story. And there's been sort of this rush to try to make sense of things when I think even the players involved are not even clear what's going on yet.
Right. So let me bring Chris Clary into this. Now, there's a very interesting op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by Tunku Vardarajan, who's an Indian-American analyst. And I'm actually quoting from what he wrote. This is, if I remember correctly, probably the ultimate or the penultimate paragraph of his op-ed. And he says, and I quote, "Morally murky as it may be, the Allies need to find a way to get Mr. Trudeau to walk back his accusation. At the same time, and as part of the compromise, it has to be made clear to Mr. Modi that there can be no assassinations by Indian operatives on the territory of friendly countries." Now, this is as close to actually saying, well, perhaps India did this, and now there's need for reasons of bigger issues, geopolitics, and the fact that, you know, the West needs India as part of its Indo-Pacific strategy for both sides to kind of walk back.
You know, most issues like this, where you have a controversy, where there's an allegation of a violation of a norm or a law by another state, you know, they don't normally end with a high-profile brokered settlement. They often fade away with time. So the government of India, which had known about the allegation for a while, apparently, decided when Trudeau went public to come out swinging, right? They said it was absurd and crazy, and India wouldn't do it. And they also said that Mr. Nijjar deserved to die anyway. So those are a bit in tension, those two messages, but that's okay. They're not logically incoherent. But I think, as Derek and you were talking about, I read the External Affairs Minister's comments in New York as being more conciliatory than the press statement from his ministry that was released in the immediate aftermath.
Correct.
And I'm not sure why that was. Maybe the responses diplomatically more than they expected. Maybe when you're in New York, when you're overseas, you behave differently than when you're at home. But, you know, Mr. Trudeau, ministers in his government say that this news was going to come out anyway. He was worried that he would seem asleep at the wheel. And so he had to get in front of that statement. You can't allow foreign governments to murder your citizens within your territory without saying something about it. So that's an unenviable position he's in. But my expectation is he probably does not have a long shelf life as Prime Minister of Canada. There will be a natural page turning if his government is ousted at the polls later. And these things can fade away slowly. And this issue of the number of Canadian diplomats in India can be readjudicated in the future. But I think everyone is, as Derek and you were talking about, trying to buy time. And then, you know, it is possible the investigation will proceed, right? Canada has an independent judiciary. They're going to want to look into this. If there are Canadian citizens or others that are named that need to be, brought to justice or indicted or things come into the public record, those will only be partially in control of the Canadian executive. And that process will play out. And sometimes it might be embarrassing to India. Even very competent intelligence agencies make mistakes. The U.S. CIA has gotten caught doing bad things. The Mossad gets caught doing bad things. Certainly the Russians have been caught doing bad things in recent years. There's cameras everywhere. People make errors.
Yeah, but let me...
And it's very unlikely you can do this without getting caught.
Chris, but let me interject here. So Karan Thapar, who's a famous Indian journalist, as you know, had Amarjit Singh Dullat, the former R&AW chief, on his program, in which Karan asked Mr. Dulat pointedly whether R&AW has ever been involved in extrajudicial killings. And Mr. Dulat said in no uncertain terms that this has never happened. And he said that he did not know of any such incident. Now, I will leave aside the fact that, that's at best dissembling and at worst lying. But the point is that, as you said, that intelligence agencies do cloak and dagger stuff. But I just pointed this out because we have on the record a former R&AW chief saying that R&AW does not do this.
It is important for international law that people have to pretend in public that it matters, right? Yeah. It's hard to say certain things out loud. The cost of lying about them are pretty minimal. So who knows? Maybe he's true. Maybe it's true. Maybe among the external intelligence agencies of the world, India's has kept a very clean hands. That's possible. I do not see as many Indian denials about allegations that similar Sikh separatists in Pakistan have been killed over the last year. I don't see very fervent arguments that is absurd to allege, even though that has been reported in both the Indian and Pakistani press. Correct. So the great thing about intelligence agencies is their actions are deniable in public. They realize that. That's part of the reason you use them instead of using your militaries.
Correct. Now, here's the thing, Chris. The response from Canada's allies, whether it's the United States, actually, Jake Sullivan had to ultimately come online and say, well, there's no wedge between Canada and the United States, but the UK, which has been trying a bilateral trade deal with India, their response has been fairly muted. In fact, Secretary Cleverly did not even mention India by name. The Aussies also, while saying that they're deeply concerned, did not name India. Now, when I see this, for instance, the contrast here, if we go back to 2018, when agents linked to Russia tried to assassinate Sergei Skripal and his daughter, Yulia, what happened? The UK allies, which includes the United States, Canada, France, others, threw out, if I remember correctly, something like 100 Russian diplomats. Now, if we compare that response to what has happened now, there's a clear contrast.
You treat your enemies differently than you treat your friends. And that is a normal part of human endeavors. If you were to have a gathering at your house and somebody accidentally broke a piece of furniture, you would handle that differently if it was somebody that was a person you hoped would be a future business partner than you would if it's somebody that you had a long-standing dispute with. So there is a desire by the rest of the Five Eyes partners, and probably even Canada itself, for this to go away. But, one thing that institutionalized democracies are bad at is burying inconvenient truths. So if Trudeau were to have ignored this, could he have kept the silence of everyone in the Canadian Security and Intelligence Services and law enforcement from never revealing this? I doubt it, right? The one thing about democracies is they're leaky. And so one thing politicians have to do because of that leaky tendency is they have to get in front of these problems. And that's what we are doing now. India has decided to escalate so that these accusations are not allowed to linger. But that's the situation that we'll all have to manage. And I expect it will slowly die down, slowly fade away with periodic escalations as news leaks or the law enforcement investigation continues.
Right. Derek, so the Financial Times wrote this article, The West Modi Problem. In fact, I was silently chuckling. I saw one of your tweets which said that, you also quoted in that article. And you said, I would have headlined it as Modi's West problem. So I was chuckling. But it quoted Vincent Rigby, Trudeau's former national security advisor. And I'm quoting from what FT wrote about what Rigby said. And Rigby said, Canada is in a difficult position here. I don't think they had a choice but to come out. Ultimately, if another country does this on your soil, you have to hold them to account. But Canada doesn't hold a lot of cards. I think India holds all the cards. Do you agree with what Rigby is saying?
I do, for the most part. I mean, yes, Canada is a longstanding NATO ally of the United States, right? And there's a lot of, I guess, influence as being part of the NATO alliance that Canada derives. However, India, especially since the start of the war, Russia's war in Ukraine, has really become the strategic crossroads of the world, right? I mean, India is being courted not just by the West, not just by the United States, but the broader West, but also Russia, China, and other countries, right, to secure their interests when it comes to the context of the war. And then as we saw during India's G20 summit, right, India is really trying to fashion itself as the voice of the global South. We can debate whether that is true, right? It's still kind of controversial, right? But at the same time, they are fashioning themselves as so. And I think that they now at least are challenging China to maintain that voice of the global South, right? And so it's going to be, and I've said this in the past many times on the record, and I'll say it again, I believe India is an emerging great power.
No, but Chris, this thing about shared values, the largest democracy in terms of numbers and the rest of it. Frankly, and I'm not speaking here as a Pakistani. I mean, I can quote you a number of analyses and assessments by Indians themselves, which have been basically rubbishing this claim, because at least over the last 8-9 years, we have seen India slide back on a number of benchmarks, their own constitutional benchmarks, that it is hard to actually accept the fact that India is, I mean, yes, the form of democracy is there. You got elections and the rest of it. But whether the substance is still there, whether you can actually, whether it ever was a liberal democracy, or whether even in terms of its illiberalism, the extent of illiberalism has gone on a measure of 1 to 10 from like 3 to 7 or 8. Is this just part of rhetoric? Is this just about sheer geopolitics? I mean, I shouldn't be asking this because, frankly, I'm a structural realist myself. But because I'm moderating this program, I have to ask you this. What do you make of this?
It's easier when you need to say that the U.S. and India relationship is motivated by shared values if everyone believes it. That's easier for people to say. I think it's probably especially easier for the Democratic Party and analysts and operatives aligned with them if that were true. But as you sort of suggest in your question, international politics is not the realm for purity test. The U.S. was able to have a relationship with Duterte in the Philippines when he was engaged with extrajudicial killings because the Philippines is an important location. The U.S. had relations in the past with South Korea and Taiwan when they were dictatorships because they were important locations. The U.S. has had an important relationship with Pakistan during many dictatorships because it was an important location. Pakistan still gets invited to the Democracy Summit, even in these current questionable times, because of the importance of that relationship. So important countries get away with things that unimportant countries don't. Poor Bangladesh is the only one that seems to be getting punished for its democratic sins among other people in the region. And that's just the way that politics works. There's no other billion people countries in Asia that you can find to deal with China. And the U.S. is not seriously reconsidering the problems that are going with Xi Jinping's China. And that means that you're going to have to overlook any problems that might exist with an Indian partner as you do that.
Right. there was this interesting indirect exchange at the UN between Jaishankar and Bob Rae. So Jaishankar said during his speech that the world must not countenance that political convenience determines responses to terrorism, extremism, and violence. And Ambassador Rae, by turn, insisted that we cannot bend the rules of state-to-state relations for political expediency. So there are two things here. One is geopolitics aside, and we've discussed that. And, there's a strong case to be made for that. But Canada, or the Canadian legal system, is not really, I'm assuming, I may be wrong, but I'm assuming that they're not going to walk this back if the Canadian government comes up with the kind of evidence that it says that it has. So there's going to be, I'm assuming there's going to be a sort of discrepancy, if you will, between how geopolitics works and how the Canadian legal system is going to work.
Yeah, that happens sometimes. The U.S. Repeatedly during the global war on terror found itself enmeshed in legal controversies, especially with its Western European allies. In some cases, the Western European intelligence agencies of those countries were well aware of what the U.S. was doing, but the judiciary and the law enforcement branches continued investigations that were quite unpleasant for the U.S. to go through. That is part and parcel of living in countries with division of responsibility across different branches. And that may be a problem that Canada will have to navigate and others will have to deal with as Canada goes through that journey. So it's, in terms of the UN rhetoric, diplomats are paid to take difficult issues and elevate them to altitudes where the position of their state seems admirable and clear. And these diplomats both found lofty rhetorical heights that they could scale and make an argument that they hoped would be persuasive to others. But, that a track record, especially because of the US-led global war on terror, means that there is going to be a perception of double standards if India suffers much punishment. My expectation is that we have already seen probably the extent of the cost for India in this matter, that there will be a harm, temporary but real, to the Canada-India relationship, and some bad press for a few weeks. And then I expect things to revert to their previous course, unless there are other allegations or other worrisome incidents that make people doubt India's liberal democratic credentials.
But Chris, how's the US going to position this? In the sense that, if there is sufficient evidence, and I'm actually assuming that the American intelligence and security agencies already have that evidence. There's the whole sort of diplomatic niceties and nuances and sensitivities involved. But as Ambassador Cohen said, that, if the resource is Five Eyes, then the US probably already has that evidence. And I'm just assuming that they're trying to, through back channels, just trying to sort of, do something to ameliorate the situation. But it still puts the US in a tough spot vis-a-vis a treaty ally and also a state that the US has been trying to position as a countervailing force to China.
Yeah, this is something you will, the analogy to your personal life is not that different. You have had friends with very, very stern, powerful disagreements. And you have, I'm sure, decided at some points that you wanted to avoid getting enmeshed in their disagreement. Even if you thought maybe one of the friends had merit to the claim, it might not be worth it for you to rupture your relationship with the other party, right? So I think the U.S. system, which is also leaky because of its long democratic credentials and its quite aggressive press reporting. The U.S. system, it's hard for it to lie for a friend. It's hard if the U.S. believes that the allegations are credible that Canada is making. It's hard for the U.S. to go out and say, no, they are not. So instead, I think the U.S. will attempt to sidestep the issue, ask for continued investigations, and not talk about it in the public commentary. And when questioned, do its best not to throw its Canadian partner under the bus. Even though Canada is small, it's next door. There's decades of cooperation, and that's a relationship that is of value to U.S. decision makers, even as they attempt to continue their courtship of India.
There's one other thing, which is not just, I mean, of course, I'm pegging it on what's happening right now, but it's a more sort of generalized problem, which is that post-World War II, for instance, there was Japan, there was defeated Germany, both defeated powers, and they were co-opted. And within the global security architecture, post-World War II, and the idea was at that time that these countries will become US allies, will become part of that global security architecture. They will not be militarily powerful, but there will be a paradigm in which they will acquire the kind of economic heft, which they did. Now we are slowly moving towards, and here the Russo-Ukraine war also comes in, we slowly move to a point where that paradigm seems to be in peril, in the sense that countries are saying, well, this is a hard power moment. And that particular paradigm is not useful anymore. Now, I'm assuming that and I'm not saying that the US will throw Canada under the bus, but I'm assuming that Canada also is feeling the pinch of that hard power moment. You know what Rigby said about, India holding all the cards and Canada not holding. So, do you fear that this kind of feeling can actually lead to more and more countries thinking that they need to acquire hard power? I mean, for instance, look at the Suez crisis. And the French decided post-Suez crisis that they won't have their nuclear weapons capability, right? So these things also have consequences. I just want to get your sense of what you think of, what I've said.
After World War II, the U.S. obviously made a concerted effort to make sure that the states that the U.S. viewed as aggressors in that war did not repeat that aggression. So it cut Germany in two, and split that with the Soviet Union to make sure that Germany did not rise again in the same way. And then it gave Japan a pacifist constitution, right? So those are very powerful measures the U.S. took to try to prevent those states from being poles that were dangers to the system. We're in a different era. India's fought 5 wars. None of those were with the U.S. And even though the U.S. was not especially excited about 3 or 4 of those wars with Pakistan, the U.S. was on India's side in 1962 in its war with China. So India is different in that regard. But I think we're already at a place that countries are not leaving a lot of power potential on the board. Post-Abe Japan thinks about military policy differently than the Japan of my youth. Germany, obviously, a reunited Germany, has not, embraced militarism by any standpoint, but has taken a more assertive role within Europe and even during this crisis with Ukraine. So I don't see a lot of countries that are abdicating hard power. And if they are, they're doing so because they have other pressing domestic needs. They have welfare states, they have aging populations. There's other reasons that they're not spending more on their military. So India will have some advantages that come so long as its economy continues to grow. If its economy starts faltering, that may make it a less attractive partner for others. But that will provide a lot of wind at India's back. But to the extent that India is viewed as an illiberal, undemocratic place, then it is also the case that in the US and Western Europe, that may generate hesitation and concerns about that partnership, even if it doesn't totally obviate the logic that has motivated it. And that logic is that China today is more aggressive than it's been at any point since Mao died. And that change in aggressiveness, the world is responding to. And India has been a beneficiary in a way, both a target of and a beneficiary of a more aggressive China.
Right. Chris, one final question before I go for the closing. Now, if India gets a pass, well, not exactly a pass, but, a rap on the knuckles for doing this, then, and I'm asking you this question because you've done a lot of work on South Asia, India, and Pakistan, and you're quite familiar with the kind of relationship or non-relationship that we have with India. You're also familiar with the two dossiers that we gave to the UN and to the world capitals with reference to India's funding and India's assassination campaigns and the rest of it. We have been at the sort of short end of the stick for a fairly long time. I'm assuming that while India may be more cautious in terms of doing something like this in countries that are friendly countries and of friendly countries or treaty allies of the United States, they're going to get a free hand to do this elsewhere, especially with reference to Pakistan. I mean, I quoted from what Tunku said, which is kind of instructive because it says that, India should be told that, Mr. Modi, that there can be no assassination on the territory of friendly countries, meaning that you got a free hand to do it in unfriendly countries, but don't do this on the soil of friendly countries.
There is a long tradition in international politics, and especially politics in South Asia, of countries supporting the proxy militant groups that are hostile to their adversaries. Right.
Correct.
So that is an allegation that sometimes clearly is true. Right. It is clearly the case that the government of India supported the Bengalis in the 1970 to 1971 crisis. Right. They supported them enormously and helped facilitate the eventual liberation, in their words, of what used to be East Pakistan. There have been allegations my entire adult life that India has supported Baloch or Sindhi or now
the LTTE in Sri Lanka.
Well, that also there were India maybe supported a group that it had to intervene against later in Sri Lanka, right?
Yes.
So one day they were arming, and the other day they were getting targeted by those arms.
Yeah.
So that is something that intelligence agencies do. Sometimes India has suffered blowback from that behavior, as the Sri Lankan case indicates. Pakistan is also aware of the dangers of this sort of game, both playing it and being on the receiving end of it. So it is hard for others to come down on Pakistan's side so much that if India does believe that supporting these proxies is beneficial, that the U.S. or others can change India's calculation.
So at the end, so basically the bottom line is, on this ledger, the bottom line is, up until India is useful, its economy grows, it has a lucrative market, and it plays ball with the United States in being a countervailing force to China, everything is going to be hunky-dory. That's the bottom line.
There's a scene in the Quentin Tarantino movie, Inglourious Bastard, toward the end, when the Christoph Waltz character is saying, "You're going to get in such trouble, they're going to arrest you." And they said, "No, I'm going to get chewed out, but I've been chewed out before," right? So that happens in international politics. You get caught, you get chewed out. You have these rap on the knuckles is the phrase you've been using. There may be meaningful cost to India if it engages in behavior that Western Europe, that other partners find contrary to the norms of the current international system. They may decide not to have their intelligence agencies cooperate as much with India as they would in the past. But those are, relatively modest consequences. And India's big choices about whether to support those groups, I think, will largely depend on the bilateral relationships in question. And Pakistan and India have been pulling various levers against one another for long before I was born. And I think that sometimes dirty game will continue, and many innocent people will be caught in the crosshairs of that. But my hope is that eventually there is a stepping back and a movement toward rapprochement. But I don't see us near that point at the moment.
Right. Last week, I wrote something. Actually, I wrote it before Ambassador Cohen talked about Five Eyes being one of the resources for this intel. So the final paragraph of my article was that there will be a lot of heartburn when the dust settles on this brazen act by India. India will not likely come out completely unscathed. There may also be an attempt to distinguish between this as an act by the Modi government rather than India. But in the end, Niger will likely become a distant memory as the world powers attend to more selfish interests in the shadow of evolving geopolitical competition. So I'm happy that what I wrote last week is more or less the conclusion of this discussion also. But thank you so much for being on the program. I'm really grateful. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button that helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.